I'm particularly delighted now to introduce our next speaker, Edward Klein. He is the author of numerous top bestsellers, most recently The Amateur, Barack Obama in the White House. Reading this groundbreaking, revealing, and very disturbing volume should be part of any voter ID process in every one of the 57 states. And at 10 a.m., I understand he's going to be doing a book signing in the exhibition hall, so there's your chance. I say I am particularly pleased to introduce Ed because it offers me a chance to get even with Klein. Back in the 1980s, I had the great good fortune to write several cover stories for him when he was heading the New York Times Sunday magazine. As a writer, I can safely say that Ed Klein is a real pain in the ass. I'd spend days, weeks even, working on a 4,000 or 5,000 word opus, each of which, and I say this with absolute candor, each of which could quite possibly qualify as among the best things ever written in the English language. I'd turn it in, and in an hour or two, Ed is on the phone. Just a couple of things about your good piece, he would say. And an hour or two later, I had a list of maybe 15 or 20 things that Ed wanted changed with more research and rewriting. I hate rewriting. Ergo, I hated Ed Klein phone calls. What was particularly annoying about Ed Klein's editing was that it was almost always making the piece better. So, who can complain legitimately? Ed's in a soundproof booth off stage right now, so please don't tell him I said any of this. Klein finally saw the error of his ways and returned to life's most important calling, which is writing. And our nation is the better for it. In the past, he's examined with an uncommon critical eye the Kennedy family, dynasty, and Hillary Clinton. All bestsellers, of course, and all works that told us things about their subjects that we hadn't read elsewhere. That's key. Almost as good as the fact that both books annoyed the hell out of the right people. The mainstream media is properly embarrassed by what it did not write much about back in 2007, 2008, the real person who is Barack Obama. So it's trying to ignore Klein's latest trenchant examination of a popular Democrat that paints a stunning profile of a man who quite likely would not be president had all of this been known back in 2008. Now that it is known, one can only hope the error will be rectified in 116 days. However, better late than never. Word has gotten out about The Amateur. It's flying off the bookshelves 6 weeks, top of the bestseller list. Because once again, it tells us so many things we did not know about its subjects, things he'd rather we did not know. And now we can thank Freedom Fest for the opportunity to hear straight from Ed Klein himself. He may have been a pain in the ass for writers, but he's a breath of fresh air and a blessing for informed Americans and voters. Ladies and gentlemen, a distinguished American and my ex-editor, Edward Klein.
Well, Andrew, I've got news for you. I wouldn't change a word. I want to thank Mark and Joanne for inviting me to speak here today, and for all of you to turn out to hear Mr. Forbes and stick around for his follow-up speaker, myself. Just before I got on a plane to come out here to Las Vegas, I received an email from a very conservative friend who has a home in the Hamptons. You know the Hamptons on the east end of Long Island. That's ground zero for the mainstream media and the left-wing Hollywood crowd. Everybody from Steven Spielberg to Katie Couric has a home out there. To give you an idea of what the Hamptons are like, people in the Hamptons were shocked when Ronald Reagan was elected president because they didn't know anybody who had voted for him. That's the Hamptons. Well, it seems when my friend went to the local bookstore in the Hamptons and asked for a copy of my book, the salesman behind the counter said, "We don't stock The Amateur." "How can you not stock The Amateur?" He asked. "It's been the #1 book on the New York Times list for several weeks." And you know what the salesman replied? He said, "Our customers would be upset if we put that book on display." Yes, my friends, the poor progressive babies who own all those multi-million-dollar homes out there, Steven Spielberg and Katie Couric, they would be upset to even look at the cover of my book. And there you have, in my view, the mainstream media in a nutshell. If they don't like you, if you somehow offend their delicate sensibilities, and if you don't drink their Kool-Aid, they close their eyes and they pretend that you don't exist. It's like the old Soviet Union, become a non-person. Now, I believe it's happening all over America to people who don't drink that Kool-Aid. It's happening in newsrooms. It's happening in college campuses. It's happening in foundations. It's happening, I'm sad to say, in some mainstream churches. And it's happening, of course, in Hollywood and in TV production studios. Left-wing culture is spreading across America like the proverbial blob in that science fiction movie, terrorizing and devouring everything in its way. And if you don't drink that Kool-Aid, you become marginalized by the apparatchiks of the cultural establishment. And that's what happened to my book when I published The Amateur. The book has been completely ignored by the mainstream broadcast television shows that do interviews regularly with authors. The Today Show, Good Morning America, Charlie Rose, Piers Morgan, The View. I've been on all those shows for previous books, but not one of them called me and asked me to be on the show for The Amateur, Barack Obama in the White House. And if it wasn't for Fox News, the Fox News channel, and conservative talk radio shows, and for listeners of those shows like you folks, no one would have heard of the book, and Mark and Joanne wouldn't have invited me to talk to you here today. So I'm blessed that there is a Fox channel, and I've been on, I think, 150 or more radio shows, and we do have an alternate way of getting through to the American public, and increasingly I hope and pray that the mainstream media is becoming more marginalized and less important. You know, we sometimes forget that book publishers and booksellers are, in fact, an important part of the mainstream media. In fact, most of the people in book publishing are to the left of Rachel Maddow, and that's pretty far left. Last year, 330,000 book titles and editions were published in America, and the vast majority of the political books were left-wing messages. Now, as someone who, as you just heard from Andrew, was an editor at the New York Times, I guess you could say that I used to be a card-carrying member of the mainstream media. But that was a long time ago. I left the Times in 1988. It was a different New York Times back then, I give you my word. To paraphrase Ronald Reagan, I didn't leave the mainstream media left me. You could say that since I left the Times, I found freedom in an unfree world, which of course is the theme of our conference today. And I hope that I have advanced the cause of that freedom with my book. In the course of researching the book, I interviewed nearly 200 people, both former and present members of the Obama administration, members of the White House press corps, Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill, African-American political leaders. A number of those African-American political leaders urged me to go and interview the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, Barack Obama's minister for more than 20 years. And you know what I told them? I told them, I'm not interested in interviewing the Reverend Wright. This is the same guy who gave these hate-filled sermons about America, about white people, about Jews, about Israel. I didn't want to have anything to do with him. But these same people told me, you got to see the Reverend Wright because he has a story to tell you that no one has heard before. So I put aside my compunctions and went to see the Reverend Jeremiah Wright in his office in, you will not believe this, the Kwame Nkrumah Academy. That's where he has his office. The Kwame Nkrumah Academy is named after the late Marxist dictator of Ghana. After we sat down, I asked the Reverend Wright if I could tape record the conversation, and he said, sure, why not? And then we had a 3-hour interview, tape recorded. I've released the entire tape to the press, and I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that except for Sean Hannity on Fox, the media has completely ignored this tape. And they've ignored it despite the fact that the Reverend Wright told me some things that most people had never heard before. For instance, he told me that when Barack Obama first came to him in the 1980s, he was steeped in Islam. Those were the Reverend Wright's exact words. He was steeped in Islam. Obama knew a lot about Islam, he said, but he didn't know much about Christianity because he had been raised in Indonesia. His stepfather was a Muslim. His stepsister was a Muslim. The family were Muslims. His mother was a nothing. She didn't believe in anything. And he knew a lot about Islam, but very little about Christianity. So the Reverend Wright said, I offered to bring him to Christianity and to Christ. Well, I was taken aback, and I said, are you telling me that you converted Barack Obama from Islam to Christianity? And this is what the Reverend Wright told me. This is his minister, a man who knew him for 23 years. He said, that's hard to say. That's hard to say. He wouldn't confirm or deny that he had, in fact, converted Obama from Islam to Christianity. Now, no one has ever heard about that before, I give you my word. But he went on to say something else. He said, I'm quoting here now, Barack and Michelle Obama are not church people. Church is not important to them. They didn't even send their daughters to Sunday school. Unquote. Trinity United Church of Christ, the Reverend Wright's Black Liberation Theology church, with its 8,000 affluent and politically connected members, many of them African Americans. That church was not the spiritual home for Barack Obama, it was his political base.